CBS News Justice reporter Paula Reid is here with us now. So, Paula, take us through this. What more can you tell us about the judge's rulings?
We want to be clear. This is definitely breaking news. This order was issued from the bench, which means we don't have a paper copy, and we're relying on what was relayed to us from the courtroom. But the Washington Attorney General's office tells me that the judge said that this is immediate. This goes into effect nationwide and globally, and effectively put on hold several of the key, most controversial provisions of this executive order. That includes the complete ban on Syrian refugees. That includes giving some people preference for other religious beliefs. So most of the key provisions of this have been essentially put on hold. And I am told the Washington Attorney General believes this makes it as if the order was never signed.
So how does this order differ from the other ones? I believe New York had one when this all first happened. Tell us how this one differs.
So when it came to the orders that were issued in Brooklyn and Boston last week, those were filed on behalf of specific people who were impacted by the ban once it went into effect. Remember, it went into effect late Friday. Some people were in the air, some people were in transit. People got caught up, and lawsuits were filed on behalf of those people. Temporary restraining orders were also issued, but the Trump administration said, look, those only apply to people who were caught in transit. And now we've sorted through that, and the law still stands. It hasn't been struck down on its merits, so we will continue to enforce it. And it'll be interesting to see what the White House says about this order. The Department of Justice says it is still reviewing this order to determine what exactly it means, but there's a lot of wiggle room here for the administration to say, oh, this is nothing, this doesn't matter, and until this law is struck down, we will continue to enforce it. You know, there's been a lot of interpretation about what these temporary restraining orders mean. Usually it's pretty clear. If a judge says stop it, you stop it.
And because if, for example, so let's talk about it from a practical standpoint. Somebody who is arriving tomorrow, this is a federal judge, meaning that it applies to the entire, and you said it's nationwide, globally. What happens if they arrive at JFK Airport tomorrow, knowing that this has been temporarily stopped?
It depends on how the administration interprets this order. If the administration says that they are going to follow this to the letter, it would appear that they can no longer prevent people from boarding those planes in their country of origin from coming here. But they may have a different interpretation of how this order should be applied. So it's a big TBD, depending on what the administration says to the Department of Homeland Security and what they tell their folks on the ground.
So would they have to appeal this, in other words, in the end?
There's a lot of options on the table immediately. The Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security, anyone a party to this case could go to the judge and say, we want an injunction on this temporary hold. They could appeal it to the next level of court. I think you're going to see a lot of litigation on this, and there's so many other lawsuits percolating across the country. But on its face, based on what we are told right now by the Washington Attorney General's office, because that's all we have to go on, this appears to invalidate the president's executive order on immigration temporarily.
You, in your discussions with the folks in Washington and in your reporting, you say that it's based on constitutional considerations. What are those considerations?
Yes, unlike some of the other lawsuits that had been filed initially, they're saying here that this law discriminates against people based on their religion. And that's really what this next wave of lawsuits needs to get at, some sort of constitutional concern about this law, because that's how you get it to the Supreme Court, and that's how you get a final answer on whether or not this is constitutional on its face, and whether what has been done is within the president's constitutional powers. As we know, President Obama ran into some trouble at the Supreme Court trying to go a little too far with an executive order on immigration. So they're still trying to determine and define the limits of the president's power.
So it feels like right now we're just still kind of in limbo stage.
Exactly. It's very much in limbo. That's why I caution this is breaking news. There's no written order. It was not helpful in a situation like this. Please put it in writing for all of us, and it will be codified eventually. But based on the Washington Attorney General, what they are saying is that this is a big victory for the state attorney generals who are individually challenging this law across the country.
Paula, and maybe our viewers don't know this, but I think you've appeared on CBS News and CBSN enough times to know that you're a lawyer. Could this all have been avoided if the Trump administration had checked with the DOJ, if they had checked with other officials to ensure that the executive order was taking into consideration these constitutional considerations that you're discussing?
Well, they did go to the Office of Legal Counsel, which is a part of the Department of Justice that reviews executive orders. That's one of their primary tasks. And they released that what the Office of Legal Counsel said not that long ago. They released it, I think it was just yesterday, and it was very sparse. It was a very minimal review, and they said on its face it was illegal. It was not a deep analysis, the kind you often see from the Office of Legal Counsel. Now, as you may remember, the Deputy Attorney General earlier this week said that wasn't enough for her. She was acting Attorney General. She said, the Office of Legal Counsel didn't take into consideration the broader policy implications, and therefore I am not going to enforce this even if the Department of Justice gave it a rubber stamp. So clearly, the minds at the highest levels of the Department of Justice have disagreed. At this point, we have a new acting Attorney General, and he has said that the Office of Legal Counsel's opinion was enough for him, and it is once again being enforced.
So I just want to let our viewers know, on the website of the Washington State Attorney General, we do now have this order. I'm going to let Paula read it while I take our viewers through it. At one point, it says the Constitution prevailed today. No one is above the law, not even the president. This is the court order halting the Trump immigration action. A federal judge in Seattle today granted Attorney General Bob Ferguson's request to immediately halt implementation of President Donald Trump's executive order on immigration nationwide. It goes on to say the temporary restraining order will remain in place until U.S. District Court Senior Judge James L. Robart considers the Attorney General's lawsuit and challenging key provisions of the president's order as illegal and unconstitutional. If Ferguson prevails, the executive order will be permanently invalidated nationwide. So there's another step that needs to happen here, Paul, if I'm reading this right.
There's a lot more steps. This is just a temporary restraining order, which means for now, until we actually sort out the constitutional merit of this order, you cannot enforce it. It's common when you're arguing these big constitutional questions to put an injunction on whatever law it is, be it transgender rights, be it immigration, any of these big constitutional questions. But it appears at this point, I don't see the order specifically in here. I think this is still a statement. We're relying solely on the Office of the Attorney General from Washington State declaring this a victory. But I caution you, there were people who came out of the Brooklyn cases and the Boston cases, and they said it was a big victory for them, and it was. But the White House had a very narrow interpretation of what those victories were. They said, yeah, you won on that, we'll follow that law, but broadly speaking, the law remains intact. We still do not, at this point, have a response from the White House on how they will interpret this and how they will tell the federal agencies responsible for enforcing this how to proceed.
Well, the Assistant Attorney General did speak earlier. Let's go ahead and play that sound.
The law is a powerful thing. It has the ability to hold everybody accountable to it, and that includes the President of the United States. Judge Robart's decision, effective immediately, effective now, puts a halt to President Trump's unconstitutional and unlawful executive order. I said from the beginning, it is not the loudest voice that prevails in a courtroom. It's the Constitution.
Pardon me, that was the Attorney General Bob Ferguson speaking there. Some strong statements there, Paula, from the Attorney General.
Yes, I am reading them actually right now. I mean, they definitely consider this a huge victory for the Constitution, as they said, but they know too that this is just one step in a series of steps. Ultimately, this question will probably be decided by the Supreme Court, because the last time this question went before the Supreme Court, they didn't actually reach a decision. There were only 8 justices. It got sent back down. There are a lot of questions about just how far the president can go when it comes to regulating, legislating immigration policy. So I think ultimately this question is destined for the Supreme Court.
How long could that take?
Oh, that could take a while. I mean, it could take 6 months to a year, but if it takes long enough, they could have 5 justices, which would impact whether or not they could get a decision. It would be a lot easier to try to get a majority.
So if they argue this up to the Supreme Court, so what does that mean? Again, I'm sure for people who are watching and are like, look, I have a relative who has a visa to visit the United States. What does it mean for them? They're coming from a country that's perhaps on one of the list of those 7, or perhaps, if for 120 days there was a ban on people coming from everywhere. What does that mean for them?
Well, first of all, they shouldn't worry, because I've passed bar exams in 2 different states. I've talked to the Department of Justice and I've talked to the Attorney General's office, and I'm still not 100% confident, and I want to couch everything. This is just what we know now. Ultimately, the final answer on what happens to those people will likely come from the Supreme Court in terms of whether or not what the president put on paper, whether or not it was within his power, and whether or not it was constitutional. Right now, they're trying to make the argument that this discriminates against people based on their religious beliefs. that would not hold up at the Supreme Court. But the White House argues that this is not religious-based, that this targets specific countries that do not have the kind of vetting, that do not have the kind of governments, that do not have the kind of records that we want when we're admitting people to this country. So those are sort of the two sides, a national security interest versus a religious freedom interest. It is not clear how the court would rule if this makes it all the way to the Supreme Court.
But they could also argue, look, you've got Iraq on this list. Iraq is now an ally of the United States in the fight against ISIS. There are many Iraqis who have helped American soldiers, interpreters, Iraqi soldiers, the Iraqi military. If you're an Iraqi military officer and you want to come and visit the United States right now, you can't do that, even though you've been an integral part of this fight against ISIS.
And that's going to be the area where they're going to get some tough questions from the justices, from any judge at any level, about whether or not this was solely based on national security. Because they will argue that, look, if this was solely based on national security, this should have been more narrow. A perfect example is, why didn't you take into consideration people who had visas because of their relationships with the U.S. military, things that they had done to help ensure our security? Now, I asked the head of the Department of Homeland Security this at a press conference a few days ago. Did you give input? Were you even asked for input? And we couldn't get a straight answer. It appears that this was dictated from the top down, and while they were kept in the loop and they knew this was coming, it does not appear that the administration went out of their way to get specifics, to elicit insight that could have kept this more narrow and been more focused on national security, therefore protecting it down the line when there are appeals.
So, Paula, as this all unfolds and it's still developing, like as we sit here and
as I check my BlackBerry.
Exactly. What are you looking for next? What are the signs that you're going to be looking out for?
We want to see what the White House says, because if the White House is going to take legal action, those are more concrete steps. We'll get another answer from a judge, but the White House could come out and say, we see this. We will abide by it. We'll make sure our Customs and Border Patrol agents abide by it. But that, in their interpretation, may mean that airlines are still deterring people from getting on flights from certain countries. So it's not clear yet what the administration's interpretation of this is. And that really will decide what kind of impact this has over the next 24, 48 hours. And we know certainly not to predict what will happen in the next 72 hours, because it's just too far to see.
To be determined. Justice reporter Paula Reid, thank you.
We are back after a break. This is CBSN.